Hello friends, welcome to this module on cookies and sessions. Fine. In the earlier module, yes, we have seen about HTTP specific APIs, fine, which was we have started looking at the javax.servet.http package, where we saw the two interfaces, HTTPServletRequest and HTTPServletResponse. We also saw about the class called HTTPServlet. In this module, we'll be looking at the cookies and sessions. Yes, cookies and sessions. Anyway, sessions also many times do depend on the cookies, and the purpose of session is basically to be able to track the user. Fine. So let's start looking at this things about which the API related to cookies and session, understanding what exactly is a cookie and how a session is going to be managed in a container. Fine. So how the management of session in a container mainly is for the purpose of tracking a particular user in a stateless protocol like HTTP. Fine. We understand HTTP being a stateless protocol. Okay, fine. So let's see this. Let's start by trying to understand what exactly is a cookie. So what is a cookie? Oh, cookie. Cookie is nothing but some kind of a key value pair, some kind of a parameter which is stored on the client side. Fine. This is going to be available on the client side, but no, it is managed, it has to be managed in the client, but who is responsible for creating those key value pairs? It is the server who wants to create them. Okay, fine. It's like, where the cookies are used, a very simple application, a very simple thing. Most of the time in a website, you might have come across, as you do a login, it would ask for, okay, remember me, right? Something like, you are doing a login, it says, okay, remember me, I want a auto login next time. Oh, how an auto login would be done? Oh, for that, auto login means this login ID and password, whatever I am having, okay, I should get logged in automatically if I hit this particular URL, hit the server. Okay, I do not need to be entering a username and password here. Fine. Each time, do not show me the login screen. Fine. When I go to the root page, the index page, no, do not show me the login from there. Straight away, just log me in. Fine. Okay. So how is that managed? Oh, for managing that, yes. When it says remember me, right? Oh, many times we say remember me. Oh, who is remembering whom? Is it the server who is remembering the client? No, the server does not have the capability to remember each and every client and saying, okay, oh, he is asking me to remember me. Instead, what is being done by the server? Let us see that, what exactly is the interaction here. Okay. So, what is a cookie here? It is basically managed through cookies. What exactly is a cookie? Fine. What would be done in this case is, when you submit a request and you put the checkbox saying remember me, okay, the request which has gone, fine, the request which has been submitted, fine, it has sent the parameter saying, okay, that I want you to, I want remember me to be, remember me is checked. When this comes to the server, what the server does is, server while giving back a response is adding some header. It is adding a HTTP header, which is an indication to the client that you please remember this cookie for me. It is sending a cookie to the client. Please remember this cookie. From now onwards, whenever you connect to me, you need to send this as a token. You need to send this, that yes, this is some value which I have asked you to remember for me. See, this browser or this client here, HTTP client, is making requests to different servers. What the client is supposed to be managing, it is supposed to be remembering the various cookies, the various parameters which have been set on it by different servers. It has to remember these cookies. So, it maintains a kind of a cookie database which has to be managed server wise, URL wise. certain cookies may be specific to that URL. Oh, only if this is the URL path, then this is the cookie, then you please send this to me, fine, then this should be made available to the server. So, it will go as part of the request header. The cookies are going as part of a request header to the server, but before that cookie goes there, the cookie needs to be set up on the client. Setting up cookie on the client will be done by the server, fine. So, if the cookies are set by the client by the server on a client, the client is supposed to be remembering them for that server, fine, and maybe it is for that server. So, if whenever any request is being formatted and created on the client side to be sent to a server, it would always do a check, because there will be a phase where it will be adding up the headers for the HTTP request. So, there will be one of the things which it has to be doing is just examine its cookie database. Oh, do I have a cookie for this particular server? Was there anything which the server had asked me to remember? If there was, okay, oh, let me put that header here, and that is how the cookies are being sent from client to the server. Cookies that way are nothing but information set up by server on the client, which the client keeps on sending to the server, to that specific server whenever it is sending any request. Right? So, that is what a cookie is about. Fine. So, this is something which will help auto login, right, because auto login, oh, who is remembering that login ID and password? Not the server. What the server is doing? Server is saying, oh, remember this is your user login ID and password. Whenever you now send any request to me, you can send them through the cookie. I do not need to be sending the login page to you. If you give it to me, if that matches here, I know I can identify you, I can log you in. Okay. So, that is how the cookies are normally used. Fine. Okay. Now, something about the session, user tracking. Yes, another activity. Oh, you might have seen a shopping cart application. Fine. In a shopping cart, what is done? Oh, it is one request in which he is shown the list of all the products. The user says, okay, put this in my cart. Fine. He ticks something, puts it in the cart. Fine. So, that is one request sent to the server. Fine. Next time, another request is sent to the server, but how does the server know that this request is coming from the same client? Oh, there is one more product to be added in that cart. Whose cart? Whose cart? How does it manage all the various carts for all the users to keep track of the users? It has to keep track of users. We understand HTTP is a stateless. Fine. There was one request sent to the server from this client, and then they got disconnected. Disconnected in the sense that yes, the request was over, the response was given back to it, another list of options was shown to the client. Fine. He moves into other part of the application, and then he says, oh, I need to add one more item in the cart. Oh, when he says I want to add one more item in the cart, fine. How does he manage to when he says I want to add this? How does the server identify that this is something which is coming to be added in a cart? Which cart? Which is this user? Was there some cart created for him or not? How does he know this? For that, there has to be some mechanism of tracking each user on the server side. This tracking involves the use of session. Fine. So, we got something called HTTP session. That is an interface which is available on in the javax.servet.http package. Fine. So, let us look at this thing. Fine. How a client is being tracked. Fine. A very important thing. Fine, which is useful in so many applications. This is nothing but on a stateless protocol like HTTP, how can we still manage some transactional transactions taking place on over a multiple multiple transactions taking place for a single user and still being identified. Not each time he is saying, oh, I have to log in and do something. You do not have to be logging in each time, right. So, how does it happen? Fine. So let us see this interface called HTTP servlet, but before we look into it, fine, one important thing. What is to be done? What is the requirement here? The requirement here from the server's point of view, server would like to be able to track each client. We have the HTTP protocol where each request is a new request. you have to identify who it is. Fine. So, for this it is not that every client needs to be tracked. Fine. Or maybe we start tracking in a particular application, we might like to start tracking a client once he is done a login. Fine. Maybe it is most of the time once he is done a login, then we might like to start tracking him. See, one of the things which you very easily do through this, because he is being tracked. Fine. That is the reason why whenever you do a login, you get your whole name, you get some of your information, specific things, information which is specific to that user being displayed on all the subsequent pages after a successful login is done. Fine. After a successful login, or you see your name being displayed. Fine. Maybe if you have done some net banking application, even there also, or who is being logged in, all that information. Fine. Most of the sites they do that. Fine. Or you simply did a login once, and then all subsequent pages they just show your information. Oh, how is all that happening? One thing, start tracking user. Now, start tracking user is something which is the responsibility of the container. It is the container who is tracking the client. The user is being tracked. The responsibility of tracking a client is that of the container and not that of the servlet. Fine. Servlets are just components which are managed by the container. Fine. So, let us see what all happens within the container. Fine. Okay. So, it may be a requirement that a particular client needs to be tracked. We will see how exactly the container would know that a particular client needs to be tracked. If a client needs to be tracked, it would be an indication to be specified by the application. So, application components can say, okay, I would like that the current client to be tracked. Fine. But once it has been identified by the container that this client needs to be tracked, what the client does for him? What the client does here is, yes, it would create some kind of a, oh, we don't know a shopping cart. So, just think of him the server creating a basket. Fine. It is a basket which is being created for the client. So, we have this object of HTTP session which is similar to a basket in which we can put various things. Fine. So, yes, there is a basket which has been identified for this particular client. That is nothing but our HTTP session object. So, if a client is to be tracked, a HTTP session object would be created for him. But this HTTP session object has is being identified with the help of a ID. So, there is a session ID which is generated for the client who is to be tracked. So, there will be, see, the things which happen on the container is generation of a session ID, creation of a HTTP session object, and the subsequent response which goes from the server now would actually set up, would have a mechanism of telling the client that this is your session ID. In all your subsequent transactions from now onwards, you need to be sending this back to me. Okay. That may be set up. Find how this can be managed. This can be managed through a session ID, through a cookie. Fine. So, setting up the session ID value on the client can be done by using a cookie also. Cookie is one of the mechanisms which is being used for session tracking. Fine. So, it could be through a cookie that a tracking of client can be initiated by a container. So, container, on the container side, what is done? Creation of a HTTP session object, a corresponding session ID is generated. Session ID is being set on the client in the subsequent response which goes to the client. From that point onwards, all requests from the client contain that, because it is part of a cookie. As part of cookie, the session ID value would arrive. So, whenever any request comes from any client, look at the server, what is happening by the what is happening within the container. Whenever any request comes from a client, fine, first thing which the container would do, okay, do I have any session ID in the request? Do I have a cookie for the session ID in this request? If I have, fine, I can identify the basket, or I can identify that this is the HTTP session object for him, irrespective of what the application is doing. One of the things which is being done by the container here is to put a mark or put the timestamp on this HTTP session object that last time when I have received a request from this client is so and so. So, last requested time, fine, is being set on the HTTP session object. Fine. This is to be done because yes, we may be tracking clients, we might be creating on the server side, there might be the container might have been creating a lot of HTTP session objects because you have started tracking them, but HTTP being a stateless protocol, it would not know, the server would not know when a particular browser has been switched off, fine, a particular client just goes off. You will not be getting any more subsequent requests from that particular client. You are still maintaining, an object for him, you are still maintaining a basket for him, or that user is gone, fine. So, there has to be some mechanism of throwing away those objects, throwing away the HTTP session objects. So, to do that, fine, in order to be able to manage the HTTP session objects and not overdoing it or not having too many of them, fine, we should have that mechanism of throwing away the unwanted HTTP session objects. And for that, yes, we do some kind of a timeout, there would be a timeout mechanism. So, each HTTP session according to the requirement of the application, fine, the HTTP session would have a max inactive interval. There is a setting called max inactive interval for a HTTP session. So, if I do not have any request coming from this client which matches this particular session ID for this particular session object, then this is a session which can then be thrown away. I will believe that this session is no longer going to be valid. Even if he comes up, wakes up and comes up later, I am going to throw away. No, I do not remember you any longer. You need to restart your session. Fine. So, that is the kind of thing. So, here we can see there that yes, as far as this part is concerned, tracking of user is concerned, tracking of user is responsibility of the container. Of course, we have API to be available to the application. Fine. The servlet has this API where it can do the interaction and find out from the container about the session. Fine. Oh, for this current user, give me the session, give me his basket, I want to put something there. Fine. It is not that always here on every request he will use the basket, he is not going to be using the HTTP session. But one thing which the container has always got to do, anytime I receive a request, I need to update the corresponding HTTP session with the last requested time. This is useful because I would like to be able to throw away the unwanted HTTP session objects. Fine. So, for that, yes, last requested time is there, max inactive interval, these are two components which are available on a HTTP session object, and in this HTTP session object I can, so there can be some kind of a, from time to time there can be something working within the container which just keeps on examining all the HTTP session objects. Oh, is there a HTTP session object for which there is no request and the last requested time, the difference between the current time and the last requested time is more than the max inactive interval. If so, I know this can be thrown away and fine, and then it can free away those memory and it can fine. So, that way it can manage and it can start tracking more users. Fine. So, fine, throwing away those HTTP session object is also important aspect. Fine. So, as far as the role of container is concerned, this is how it has to manage. But one thing, how does the container know when should the container start tracking him? How does a container start tracking a particular client? Okay. So, for that has to be something which is initiated from the application component, mainly a servlet. So, a servlet, for example, what it would do is from within the service method, when it gets a request object in the HTTP servlet request, we have this method called getSession. When we invoke the getSession method, okay, this getSession method has a parameter which is a boolean parameter, fine, which is create if necessary. Fine. The boolean parameter says create if necessary. The idea here is, fine, if I say getSession and if I put the value as false, I am asking the container, are you tracking him? If you are tracking him, give me the corresponding HTTP session object, or else you can give me a null here. Fine. So, that is one thing which is if you are passing the value of false. Whereas if in case you are saying true, create if necessary. It is not that, oh, you should be creating it, fine. What is this create if necessary? If I say true and if I say get session with true, what would be done is, okay, for this particular client from where this request has arrived, do you already have an HTTP session object? If you have, you can give that to me. If you do not have, then I would like you to start tracking him from now onwards. Fine. There is no specific method which says, okay, or start tracking him. No, because you that particular kind, if he is already being tracked, okay, fine, you give me that object. I do not want to create a new HTTP session for him. In case he is already tracked, that is the session I need. Fine. So, the continuity is nothing but through the HTTP session object. Fine. The state can be managed by using the HTTP session object. Transaction states can be managed. So, if it is like similar to a basket, fine. For example, what you might do is, okay, in case you are implementing a shopping cart, you might say, oh, I have a list of products, fine. So, as soon as someone says, oh, I want to start tracking him, he says, okay, in this, recollect one more thing which I had mentioned in the last module. We have the servlet request, we have the servlet context, both of these classes, both of these interfaces having those 4 set of methods where object sharing can be done, and that exactly same 4 methods also available in HTTP session. So, what is HTTP session? I was mentioning it is a basket. Yes, it is a basket in which we can manage objects, fine. That is why I called it as a basket, a place where you can store objects, fine. So, it is nothing but that attribute thing, set attribute, get attribute names and remove attribute. Those methods again available even for the HTTP session, fine. So, that is how the HTTP session is going to be useful to be able to store objects in it. So, if someone is doing a shopping cart, what he could do is he can say, oh, let me have one attribute in which I can store a list of products which he has selected for, for to be added into his shopping cart, fine. So, whatever he selects, yes, there is a list, fine. This is a session object which is available for him. Whenever a response is given to him, if he is asking for the list, oh, show me my cart, oh, that list is available from that session, and you could be formatting a page where you show that list of what are the things in that list of products which are already added in that cart. If he says, oh, add this to the cart, what you do here is create an object for the product and add it into that list. So, you can manage a cart like by just simply using a list object within as an attribute in your HTTP session. So, HTTP session can have attributes. So, HTTP session has, yes, what are the things in HTTP session? There is a last requested date time, fine, last requested time. There is a max inactive interval, fine. It has methods for managing attributes. It has session ID, you can know what is the session ID. Oh, another important thing, how the session was obtained. Oh, it could have been it is obtained by a servlet by using the get session method on the servlet HTTP servlet request object. So, when he says get session, fine, it may have been created new if he has used a true attribute, fine. Yes, this method we understand is overloaded, get session method is overloaded. If you do not pass the boolean value, then it is considered by default it is true. So, you may pass or may not be specifying the boolean value. So, if you do not specify, it is considered as create if necessary true. Now, if you have said, okay, get session, fine, create if necessary was true, how would you know whether it is a new session object or it is something which was that this client was already being tracked and then you have got the object for it. So, that you can know by using a method called isNew. We have in HTTP session the method called isNew, by which you can find out if it is a new object for which the session information is not yet set on the client. The client is not even aware that there is that he is just started to be tracked, he is being started to be tracked. So, that is something which is available in the HTTP session isNew kind of method, fine. So, HTTP session object management to be done by these objects are managed by the container, fine, but it is the application which would use the get session method initially to be able to start tracking a client, fine. But tracking the client entirely responsibility of, once it has been started, it is then the responsibility of container. It has to manage the session objects, it has to manage the timeout values, fine. So, we have those appropriate methods in the HTTP session for setting and getting the timeout values on a particular HTTP session. As per your requirements, there might be applications which are, if it is a banking application, high security, timeout value will be, the session timeout will be much smaller, fine. But yes, in other kind of application, in other places, maybe timeout value, you may not keep a very high timeout value, fine. It's so you can decide the timeout value accordingly, fine. So that is one thing, fine. So this is about the HTTP session. Now coming to the cookies thing, fine. A few other methods. I think there are a few methods in the HTTP servlet request which are related to the session. One we saw is the get session method, that is for obtaining the session, fine. Now the session tracking, how it is done? It is done normally by using cookies. In case cookies are not available, it might be done through URL rewriting also, fine. So we have a mechanism in the HTTP servlet request, we have a method called isRequestedURLFromCookie. It returns a boolean value. So by this you could know whether this client is being tracked by using a cookie or is requested session session from URL, fine. These methods would let us know whether how he is being tracked, whether he is being tracked by using a cookie or he is being tracked by using a URL rewriting. If it is URL rewriting, it is slightly tedious for the UI part also, because UI components, wherever they are specifying a particular submit button or whatever, fine, wherever a request is being sent, the encoding of the, adding the things in the URL, the session ID needs to be added as part of the URL as a hidden parameter. So all that processing needs to be taken care of then by the UI developer also. So there will be some additional task for the UI developer, but if it is managed through cookie, it is much simpler, fine. There is nothing to worry about, fine. A session can very easily be tracked, fine. Let us now look at what we have for the what is a cookie now, fine. So that is about the HTTP session part. Now we look at the cookies, fine. Cookie, yes, we understood the concept, cookie being set. We look at the API part related to cookie. So as far as cookie is concerned, yes, we got a separate class called cookie, fine. We actually have headers, fine. There are headers in the request through which a cookie is made available to the server, fine. But initially it is actually the server who is setting up a cookie. So we understand in HTTP protocol there are headers as part of the response also. It is through the response headers where the header for the cookie, setting up a cookie, is also being set. So if a server wants, it is initially the server who would use the method to set up a cookie on the client. How does he do it? So for that, yes, before the service method is finished, fine, what is supposed to be done is a servlet, if he wants to set up a cookie on the client, it has the method in the response. So it is the method in the servlet, HTTP servlet response. We have this method called add cookie, where the parameter is a cookie. Yes, we have a separate class called cookie, which is in the javax.servet.http package. Cookie has a simple constructor, fine. You just use the key value pair, fine, a name and a value. So cookie has a cookie name and a cookie value, which can be used for creating an object of cookie. Of course, another thing in the cookie is cookie has an expiry time, fine. Oh, this cookie should be managed on the client at least for so much time. After that, that cookie need not be remembered on the client, fine. So that expiry time. So it has cookie class, cookie object has that method by which the setting of expiry time can be done, fine. You can say, okay, it can be for so many more, you can set it in number of, add the number of days from the current time and set it, okay, I want that expiry to be on so and so time, fine. So when you create a cookie object, yes, the constructor requires only the name and value, but then you might set up the expiry time, and then that is it. Just you add this to create a cookie object and add it to the response. So HTTP servlet response has this method called add cookie. That is how the server would be able to set a cookie on the client. And how does the servlet, fine, a servlet may like to check what are the cookies which have arrived from a particular client. So for that, yes, the HTTP servlet request has a method called getCookies, instead of using a method called getHeader and then trying to parse out all the various cookies which are available, fine, we have a very simple method called getCookies in the HTTP servlet request, which gives us an array of cookie. Remember one thing, normally most of the methods which return an array, if there are no cookies, for example, right, see there is something, if the method returns an array, what do we normally write? Oh, if this is a method which is returning an array, oh, I straight away go for a loop, right, to go over loop over all the elements of an array, fine, and then we do not expect a null to be returned by this, but yes, what we have here you have to be very careful. This method called getCookies is not returning an empty array. Okay, if there are no cookies, this method returns a null. So be careful, otherwise you will be getting null pointer exceptions here. Fine. So always do a check. Whenever you use the getCookies method, always carry out a check for the null. Fine. Don't just straight away go for writing a loop here. Fine. So that's something to be careful about when using cookies. Fine. Clear? So yes, in this session, in this module, what we have covered is, we have covered what is a cookie, what is this HTTP session, how it is used for tracking a client, what is the role of the container, how an application would be able to use HTTP session, fine, and creating some stateful applications, transactional applications like shopping cart, fine. So fine. In the next module, we will be doing specific, we will try to use these cookies and sessions in a sample application, fine. Okay, so thank you.